Welcome to part 2 of the retro style ray gun. If you like my videos and my content, a like and subscribe would be awesome. Let's get into it. So here we are back in Blender, and I'm now going to model the main body. So what I'm going to do again here is borrow from another object. So I'm going to tab into edit mode on that one there, select the edge loop around the edge and duplicate it and press P to separate it into a new object. Let's just quickly rename that to RG body. So there you go. There we have our edge. And what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate that, set the origin as well, in the right click context menu. Not duplicate it, we're going to extrude that along the Y axis. You notice there I've got normal as the pivot point, set it back to global, just in case. And with that edge selected, press E to extrude and Y to lock it to the Y axis. Just pull it as far as you think the body can be. You can always adjust it later on. I'm going to round it up to 3 meters, which is quite a lot, obviously, but that doesn't matter. And Control R to add some loop cuts. I've added 5 there, so I've got one in the center. All we need to do now is scale those up, but not in the Y axis. We don't want it going left and right. So press S for scale and then Shift Y to exclude the Y axis. And then we'll just continue to do those just like that. Another way to do this is to add, say, an edge running along the whole profile or a single vertex and create the profile of the shape and use the spin tool to effectively create the same shape. Many ways you can do this. You can also add a cylinder. Anyway, you can see there as I zoom in, there's a bit of a gap under that gasket. So what I'm going to do is select that last edge loop, that one there, and I'm just going to scale that up just a little bit until it closes that gap there. I think that's fine. It looks like a bumblebee, I've just realized. Right, let's turn wireframe on so we can see what we're doing and turn off the subdiv modifier. Remember, any modifiers were borrowed from the origin object that we borrowed from. So do bear that in mind. Right, so we're going to select this edge here, extrude that on the Y axis again, scale it down. I'm just going to taper this end off. There we go. And let's zoom in a bit there. Perhaps a little bit further back is good. And extrude it again on the Y axis. So E to extrude Y axis. And bring that out. And probably move that in just a little bit like that. Just so that when we get the subdiv turned back on, it just rounds it off nicely. Turn the wireframe off. In the overlays, turn our subdiv back on. And we've got the infamous pinching going on there. And the reason it's doing that is because we've got an n-gon on the end. Just there. So a quick fix for that is to join the vertices around that n-gon into quads. We'll get around to that later on. But for now, I'm going to Control R and add another edge loop here. Because I want this to be a different part of the body. Just going to scale that up just a little bit. You forgive me if you can hear any background noise. I live in quite a noisy area, so getting to do audio can be quite challenging. So do forgive me for that. Right. Where are we? Let's add the edge loop there. Scale it up. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Very bulbous. Which I hope you didn't hear that. That was a very noisy lorry just went by. Right, so Control R and add another edge loop here. I think that's where I'm going to make my cut. So just scale that up a touch, just to keep the lines flowing around, and Control B to bevel that with no segments, or just the one obviously, but and we'll delete those faces that we've just created. Now we've got this tiny hole running around the back part of the body. And now we're going to tab into, select the gasket object. Let's tab into edit mode. And with those faces selected, not Control D, Shift D, and then move those along the Y-axis to the middle of that gap. Now I'm being very precise here, but that's just the way I tend to do things. So do what, as long as it's roughly there, that's absolutely fine. But you can see there, I'm just moving it into a better position. And scale it up. And when you scale the gasket parts, make sure you click Shift Y again. We don't want it scaling in the, in the width of that. We want to keep the gaskets all the same size. Not a big deal, but it just helps to maintain some consistency. Okay, let's turn on the wireframe again and set the origin to geometry with the right context menu. For some reason, it throws it right over there. I don't know why. So what I'm going to do is tab into edit mode and select some vertices at the front and at the back, the same ones, right down the middle, and then Shift S, cursor to selected. That will put the 3D cursor bang in the middle of that. And now we can tab back to edit mode, object mode, set origin to 3D cursor. And now we have our object origin right in the center. Let's turn the subdiv back on. Great, let's add the beginning of the meter. I'm not going to model all of that right now. I'm just going to place a placeholder, basically. So I know roughly where it's going to go and how big it's going to be. So there's our cylinder. Inherited its previous settings, which is very small, from those spokes at the front. So I'm going to make some adjustments in the context menu in the bottom left. If you don't see that, just click it open. It will be there in the bottom left. I'm going to quickly speed through this because it's quite tedious. So I'm making some changes in the context menu. You don't have to do that. You could just add a cylinder the normal way and just click it and edit it in edit mode. And something like that. I'll leave that there for now. So I'm going to duplicate that shape, Shift D to duplicate it, and just pointing out there that the rotations are not at 0, 0, 0. So I'm just going to apply those. And in this case, I want to rotate this one left to right. So press Ctrl A to apply any transformations in object mode, of course. Right, let's tab into edit mode. Let's scale this down. So what I'm going to do now is just roughly block out the telescope, if that's what it's called, the scope. Shade smooth. Oops, that's way off center, isn't it? So in the x-axis, we want to put that back to 0. Do that in a moment. Let's just quickly rename that to scope, RG scope. So I'm going to select that front face and press E to extrude. Just bring it out a little bit. And that's going to be like a bit of a detail at the end there. So with those faces selected, hold down Alt, click the face, Shift D to duplicate, and then S, Shift Y to scale them out. And the rear face, we're going to select the same and do the same, E to extrude, bring that out quite a bit thicker this time, deeper. And with those faces selected, I'm going to Shift D to duplicate, S for scale, Shift Y, and just bring those out as well. Right, with that done, let's select these end faces. And now we can right click and select Bridge Faces. And now we have that. And you can see that's not quite right. So let's scale that in a little bit more. Again, Shift Y to lock the Y-axis out of the operation. That gives us our thickness to that tube effectively. Now let's switch to the side view and go to wireframe and select all of these vertices at the end and use the lovely shear tool. And you can click this bar here and drag it and hold down the control key, and you can see in the top left corner the value of the shear. And that's 0.8, as you can see there. It's probably a bit much. So let's bring that down to 0.6 maybe. Yep, that looks good. Remember that because you're going to need that later on. So 0.6, it's good to know that you've got a value you can refer to later on. So we're not quite done with the scope yet. Let's just move that along the x-axis. So in the side menu, just enter 0 on the X transform location. And let's bring that down just a little bit. Something like that. Great. Let's add the infamous subdiv modifier and turn the levels to 2 in the viewport as well. I'm going to turn off the wireframe. Now this is very rounded, of course. Everything's been averaged out, so we need some supporting edge loops. Let's turn the subdiv off so we can see what we're doing. Switch into edge mode, select some edges. I'll just fast forward that. So select all of these edges. And with those selected, I'm going to go over to the mean bevel weight and increase the value all the way to 1. Has to be 1 for it to work properly anyway. So now we can add a bevel modifier and bring that above the stack. Really important. Change the limit method to weight so we can target just those edges that we've weighted there. So with that, we can increase the segments to 2 under profile, drag that right up to 1. And all that's doing is adding edge loops, bevels, edges at either side of the edges that we've selected. Let's just bring that down to 0 so we can see, and we drag that up slowly. It helps to hold the shift key down as you're doing that for finer control. So I'll just give it a little bit of a bevel, turn on the subdiv, and that's looking really nice. Lovely. Let's turn off the wireframe again. That's looking cool, like that. And let's move on to the next part. Can you guess what that is? And before I do that, actually, let me just select these vertices there. I'll just bring those out actually a little bit more. So that back piece is a little bit more substantial. Not too much, but it helps to cement the shape. Right, on to the next part. That's the inner lining. So I'm going to borrow from this shape again. So let's switch off the subdiv so we can see, and select the inner faces by holding the Alt key and clicking on an edge. And with those selected, you can Shift D to duplicate them. Press P to separate the selection into a new object. Let's turn on the subdiv again for the scope. Let's find our object there. I'm going to rename that to scope inner. Let's get rid of turn off the bevel for now. And let's add a solidify modifier and give it some thickness. And I'm going to change the offset to 1 so it goes into the right direction. And the normals I've set onto high quality. Let's give it the thickness that we like. Helps to have the wireframe overlay turned on here. Add that to your quick favorites, by the way. I rarely see many people using that, but it's really handy. And you can add anything in under the quick favorites menu just by right-clicking on an option and selecting add to quick favorites. Okay, let's make the targeting site. Before we do that, actually, we need to fix something in a second, because I've just noticed there's because of the way we've done that, we've got a slight inaccuracy just in the top right there. You can see that there. So we're going to select that object, tab into edit mode, into wireframe, vertex mode, select all of the vertices at the end. And you want to scale them in the y-axis to 0. So S, Y, 0, enter. We'll flatten that out completely. That looks pretty cool actually, but I'm not going to leave it like that. We want to use the shear tool again. If you remember earlier, we used the value of 0.6. So as you do that, hold down the control key and you get snapping values. And there it is, exactly matching the previous shear we did on the scope. Awesome. Let's turn back on the bevel modifier and the subdiv. The bevel looks okay. Yeah. And before I move on to the next part, I'm going to switch into edit mode again on this object. Duplicate that inner face or outer face, doesn't really matter. P to separate it into a new object. And I want to call that glass. Obviously that's going to be the glass piece inside the scope. So you want to go back to vertex mode. Oops, edge mode first. Let's get rid of these mean bevel weights which are inherited from the previous shape. So reset those to 0. Select the vertices at the end. S, Y, 0, enter to flatten that out in the y-axis. Let's move those inwards. Something like that. So it's just inside the scope. And we'll go and do the same on the other side as well, just a moment. So I want to click and select there with the Alt key, just drag that in. I want to use that. What I'm doing there is holding the control key because I've got the snapping set to vertex. You don't have to do that, you just move it manually wherever you like. And at this point I'm going to scale it just a little bit smaller than the inside of that scope space so it doesn't intersect. Very important when you're using glass objects not to intersect other elements. So we just added some faces at the end of that tube now. So you can do that by pressing the F key. And with those faces selected, I'm going to press I to insert. Do that a couple of times. And we're just going to give it a little bit of a roundness at the end. So you can scale that in the Y with both of those selected. I've deleted the bevel modifier for now. And we need to also move these edge loops out just a little bit. So we continue that rounded edge. So you can press SY and shift those out. Something like that. If we switch back to solid mode in a second, we'll be able to see that. Before we do that, let's select these corner edges first. Increase the mean bevel weight to 1. Let's add the bevel modifier again. Change the limit method to weight. Profile is fine for now. I think I might leave that at 0.5 or doesn't really matter really for this. I'm changing it to 1. And if I just zoom in here and increase the amount, you can see the new edges being added there. So you're looking at roughly halfway to the connecting edges. And that's cool. And let's turn on the subdiv. You can see we've got a nice rounded shape there. That's looking quite clean. And just a quick tidy up. I mentioned earlier you can get rid of the n-gon by selecting opposing vertices and pressing the J key to join them. And now you've got quads instead of one large n-gon. Very quick. Just speed through that. And right click shade smooth. And set the origin to geometry. And that's our glass done. Let's turn on wireframe again. And what we're going to do now is add the clamp that holds the scope in place. So I want to borrow again from this object. So Select some faces, Shift D, P to separate to new selection, a new object, and rename that to something like clamp or whatever you want to call it. Not clam, clamp. There we go. And let's tab into edit mode. And of course, we're going to make this much narrower. So with everything selected, press SY and bring that in, something like that. Make it as wide as you like. There's me thinking about how much width to give this. Right, let's switch to face mode. Select the bottom faces and delete those. So with those selected, press the delete key and select faces. Now switch to edge mode by pressing 2 on the keyboard, not the numpad to the keyboard. And then with those selected, we can scale those in the X-axis to bring them out away from the body of the scope. And with those edge loops there as well, let's just turn off the subdiff so we can see what we're doing. We select those opposing ones and SX. Just bring those away just a little bit more. Now we can adjust these again. And then E to extrude, Z for the Z axis, and just shift those down. Then Control R to add a couple of edge loops. And we can select these two, and I feel that we don't need those. So I'm pressing Control D to dissolve those edges. I'm going to speed through this because it's fairly straightforward. And you can see there, just replicate something like that. And I'm also going to add a mirror modifier. So I've deleted half of the object, added a mirror modifier, and make sure you turn clipping on. And you can see there, I'm just going to mold this shape to as close as the body as I can get to. So I'm going to Control B to bevel that edge there, so we get a bit more of a bend. Let's shade smooth. So we've got the mirror modifier. Now we're going to add a solidify. Click on even thickness. Normal is high quality. Let's bring that out to a reasonable thickness. That's looking cool. Now, this is important, but the stack is important on the modifiers. Let's bring this solidify above the subdiv and also bring it above the bevel as well. Let's turn all those back on. You can see now we've got this. It's not quite there yet. So I'm going to select that edge, increase the mean bevel weight to 1. Because we already had that inherited from the parent object we borrowed from. And with that done, it's going to edit mode and add a couple of, or 3 in this case actually, 3 loop cuts along the length. That gives us a bit more geometry to work with. And it helps if you turn on the shadow actually at this point, so you can see how close things are. So we can, under this option here, you can turn on shadow. You can see we've got some gaps. So type into edit mode, select some vertices, and just move them up and down until you're happy with the snugness of that clamp along the body. So I'll just show you how to do that. So I'm just going to bring that into view. And I'm going to select vertices 1 or 2 at a time or several. Just shift them down until you can see the shadow almost gone. So something like that. I'll just speed through this because it's quite tedious. Just make sure you work your way around, including the back vertices as well. Let's just run the back as well. Let's just tidy that up. I've got a bit of a dip there, which I shouldn't probably have left, but that's okay. Barely notice it. And with that done, there we go. Looks really cool. We're going to duplicate this part now. Again, borrow from another object. We don't have to, just create a cylinder if you like. and shift it over to the front. So same principle as before. Adding a bevel modifier, solidify, subdivision, all the same things I've done several times now in part 1 and now of course this video, part 2. So pause the video here if you need to, replicate what we've done there. And I'm going to copy that object once again and scale it down to something like that. These are basically going to be like little legs or stands that are holding the target, the reticle scope. I don't know if that's reticle scope. I don't even think that's the word. The reticle targeting that thing. I'll just get on. Yeah, so just use that to hold up this element there. So I'm pressing F to create a face at the end there. Just like that. And now we have this. So I'm also going to add an edge loop down the center, pick the edge at the end and just bring that out using the normal pivot point, basically. You can always eyeball it as well and just turn off the mean bevel weight on those corner ones so we get a bit more of a rounded clamp thing. And now it's a case of just going to the front view and making micro adjustments. So we close any gaps and flatten this along the body of the front part there. So use the 3D cursor if you need to rotate around. Should be able to do this quite comfortably. You can move them manually as well. So there we go. I'm going to add a mirror modifier and click on the other object to use as the pivot for the mirror. So again, I've copied this object again. And I'm going to scale this one down, bring it underneath the target circle. Again, I'm using snapping there to vertex snapping to bring that to the same depth. And you want to scale this in all the axes apart from the Y. So you get this now. Making hula hoops here. If you like hula hoops, fair enough, they are very nice. It's going to read a bit of housekeeping. It's going to rename these. And I've copied that again and bring that into the center of the other object. Make it very small or smaller. Now we're adding a cylinder, very basic cylinder, only 8 sides, without any caps at the top and bottom. Just bring that down and then edit mode, or you can scale it in edit mode. Bring it down to something like that. Now we can rotate around the 3D cursor. This has to be done in one operation, so you can do Alt-D, R, Y, 90. Once you've done that, you can press Shift-R to repeat that macro, basically, which is really cool. Okay, so let's move over to the next part. Let's isolate this object by pressing the / or question mark key. I'm going to select these edges at the top of that. Shift-D to duplicate them. P to separate them into a new object. And we're going to use that to create some decorative wires, or they're not even wires really, technically. Just some shapes that give a bit more interest to the model. I'm going to isolate these objects so we don't have everything else on the screen. You can do that with the period key on your numpad. Let's rename that to wire. Let's shift over to the side view and put the 3D cursor in the center of the glass element that you've got there. So we're basically using the 3D cursor as a pivot point from there. So with that selected, all the vertices selected on the wire, we can press S to scale those up using the 3D cursor as our origin point. And what you're looking for is at the top there, you want to make sure that's approximately in the middle of that circle. So you can see we're slightly off, so make it a little bit smaller. And that vertex is around there. And there we go. Let's have a look at that. That's not too bad. So we're going to add or get rid of these vertices at the end. Let's delete those. Don't want it going that far. We can subdivide this one. So you can select an edge there, right click and subdivide, and we can get rid of this last vertex. I'm just thinking whether I should make any more adjustments here. I think that's fine. So we can select both of these now, switch to the side view, and press E to extrude, and then Z. So E to extrude, Z for the Z axis, and just bring them down something like that. And now you have to do them individually. Let's switch back to medium point. Let's just drag this. Let's turn off the subdiv actually for a minute. Just drag that until it's facing roughly 90-degree angle to the surface we're pointing at. But don't put it all the way to the tip of that object. Just leave it outside there, because we're going to add a bit of a foot, if you like, at the end of that. So we need a bit of a gap. So something like that. Okay, let's switch over to actually, before we do that, let's convert that curve. Let's convert that to a curve, which is now what it is. You can see there we've got the curve options. So with that, we can now easily add some body to this. But before we do that, let's just change the spline type to Bezier. And right click again and select the handle type to automatic. That will give you this nicely, apart from the corners, we'll fix those. So switch to the side view. Let's just zoom in here and grab these little handles and just move them around until you get a tighter corner. Just quickly fast forward that, but you get the idea. You can scale that as a whole. And the same for the end. So you get something like that now. Now with that, we can go back to our curve options, and under bevel, we can add some depth to that. So it gives it some thickness. And now that I think we have too many points on this curve. We don't need that many. So I'm going to select these and just delete those with Control D. And just reposition the existing curves that we get left over, so that we get a nice flowing shape. And the reason I've done that is because we don't need that much geometry, because we're going to be using a subdiv modifier anyway. So we don't need to add unnecessary detail. Cool. Right, so let's right click and shade smooth, turn the wireframe on. You can see there how much dense that is. So back to our curve options, resolution, let's turn that down to 1, that's fine. And then at the top of that, the resolution at this end, we can drop that down to a much lower value. So we get just enough geometry to work with the subdiv modifier we're going to add later. I'm going to go for 3 or 4. I think 4 looks okay. So with the object selected now in object mode, you want to duplicate that. So we can keep that as a backup, as a wire, and just drag that into, a backup collection or history. And with that done, we can now convert that back to a mesh. Just like that. Now we have some lovely polygons to work with. Just making our face orientation, making sure that's correct. We don't see any red normals facing the wrong way. Right, we need to cap off these little feet here. So in edge mode, I'm going to alt click and select that. We can press E and then S. So E for extrude, S for scale, all in one operation. And we get something like that. I'm just going to round it off to 3.75. That's perhaps a little bit too small, actually. Let's make it 4. I mean, you can make these as big as you like. Just a bit of detail. Let's switch to the side view by pressing 3 on the numpad. And I'm just going to rotate that a little bit so it's facing better with the object opposite. However, we also need to select this edge so they rotate together. There we go. It doesn't have to be very accurate because it is, it's not going to really show. Switch that to normal. And now we're facing that direction using the normals from this. And with the outer edge selected, so deselect the inner one, just the outer edge selected, press E to extrude that. And then you can press one of the axes, because I can't remember which one it is. Just look at the color of the line, maybe Z or Y. Just tap that once or twice until it matches the normal, or you can do it manually just by eye. Let's turn that back onto non-alpha because we had that from the glass, remember, that edge. With that selected, we can add a subdiv modifier, increase the levels to 2. So it looks a bit fluffy right now, very soft, which is not bad. I may want to tighten up some of these edges here. So switch back into edit mode, select some edge loops with holding down the Alt key, turn off the subdiv so we can see that one there, and select that one as well. We can use the mean bevel weight, or you can add just a Control B and bevel. Either way, it doesn't really matter, but this is just the non-destructive method. So as before, I'm using the profile of 1, segments of 2, bring that down, and then increase the value so we can see what we're getting. And there we go. So now we get a much tighter, nicer looking endpoint on these wire things. You can see though it's just clipping through the body, which is fine. It doesn't need to be above it. And the same thing on the other side now. So just repeat what you've just done there. E to extrude, S for scale. Working with the normal pivot point. Just rotate those and then select the outer one, extrude it, pull it through the body just a little bit. Minor tweaks. Just check in there. And there we go. That's one of our wires done. And again, we can use the same principle as the target reticle. So you can select this, use the 3D cursor as the orientation point there in the middle of the glass object. And we can do Alt-D to get a linked duplicate. R, Y, 45. All in one operation, so it becomes effectively a macro. And once you've done that, you can press Shift-R to repeat that as many times as you like. And this is the result. Very nice. Cool. That's looking great, I think. Now, before we finish off this front part, let's add another part to this. So I'm going to select this part and duplicate it with Shift-D. Switch into edit mode. S for scale. Oops, we're switching to medium point, of course. Go back to global. So S for scale again. Shift-Y, so we lock it. We don't scale it on the Y-axis. And we just want to make this a little bit smaller than the object we borrowed from. So leave a tiny gap there. Doesn't matter if it intersects, to be fair, but you don't want it to intersect, not too much. And with that done, let's select the inner faces. So Alt-click those. Turn off the modifier so we can see that. And then again, S, Shift-Y. And bring that snugly around the wire thing we just created. Leave a bit of a gap. Don't have to, of course, it's just what I'm doing. I'm just making this up as I go along. I think whatever looks good is fine. And we turn our modifiers back on again. that's what we have. And we just rename that to something else. Support 3, that was the easy option out. If you like this stuff, like my videos, a like and subscribe is hugely appreciated. It really helps me out. This is part 2. Join me in part 3. So for now, thanks for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.